first half of the show, documenting your specialized knowledge. First, what is specialized knowledge? Well, specialized knowledge is not common knowledge. We're all presumed to possess common knowledge. We're all presumed to know that fire is hot, ice is cold, knives are sharp, things along those lines, things you just learn from normal life experience. Specialized knowledge is knowledge that you acquire through specialized education and training. Could be self-taught, could be in some kind of class, could be this kind of content that you watch from law of self-defense. Things that the general public wouldn't be expected to be knowledgeable about, but you're knowledgeable about because of your specialized training and expertise. Why this important distinction? Well, a couple of reasons. One is that often this specialized knowledge informs your decision-making in self-defense in a way that would not be apparent to someone who lacks the specialized knowledge. So an example of this kind of specialized knowledge in a self-defense context might be the Tueller drill. The Tueller drill is an example of knowledge that helps us understand that an aggressor armed with a contact weapon can be a lethal, deadly force threat to us, even if they're not standing immediately beside us. In fact, they can be a deadly force threat at a distance that's substantially greater than an untrained person might expect. So you're being threatened by somebody with a knife, for example, and they're standing 10 feet away. Well, if they're 10 feet away with the knife, they can't extend their arm and reach you with the knife, right? They don't have 10-foot long arms. So if you were to use deadly defensive force against that person, a prosecutor might argue, they have argued, that your use of the deadly defensive force was premature because that person was not yet an imminent threat of deadly force harm to you, and that's the condition that is required before you're justified in using deadly force in self-defense. The prosecutor might pace off 10 feet from the jury box and turn back to the jurors, maybe even hold up the knife. Say, ladies and gentlemen, at this distance, with this little tiny knife, am I a deadly force threat to you? And of course, the prosecutor is trying to suggest to the jurors' minds that the answer should be no. That, in fact, the person you defended yourself against at a distance of 10 feet, armed with that same knife in evidence, was not yet a deadly force threat against which you were justified in using deadly defensive force, in which case it was not lawful self-defense, in which case you're just guilty of an unlawful killing. Convicted. In fact, the Tueller drill tells us that someone armed with a knife at 10 feet can readily be an imminent deadly force threat, because the relevant tactical question is, can they bring that knife to bear against you in a shorter period of time than you would require to defend yourself? If the answer to that is yes, then they are an imminent deadly force threat. They're within your defensive envelope. And the way Dennis Tueller did this, studied this, answered this question, he was a police officer in Salt Lake City. He was a trainer for his department. His officers faced this dilemma all the time. At what point is someone with a contact weapon actually an imminent deadly force threat against which we can use deadly defensive force? And the way Dennis framed the question for police officers was, well, how long does it take one of my guys typically to get his service pistol out of the service holster and score center mass hits on a target? And Dennis believed that that time period was about 1.5 seconds. So draw the pistol, get it on target, fire a couple rounds, center mass, 1.5 seconds. Well, then the relevant question from a distance perspective is, how much distance can an aggressor armed with a contact weapon like a knife, how much distance can they cross in 1.5 seconds? Because if they're inside that distance, well, then they can bring the weapon to bear against the officer before the officer can defend himself. If they're outside that distance, arguably, they're not yet an imminent deadly force threat because the officer still has the ability to defend himself before they could bring the knife to bear. And when Dennis studied this with many students, he had them run a certain distance in 1.5 seconds. Turns out that typically that distance is 21 feet, 7 yards. And that became known as the Tueller distance, the exercise being the Tueller drill and the distance being the Tueller distance, meaning theoretically, hypothetically, someone within 21 feet with the contact weapon is an imminent threat with that weapon. They can close the distance to you before you can defend yourself. Someone further than 21 feet is not yet. Now, of course, this is all very mathematical, and the real world is much more complicated than this. So 21 foot's not a magic number. It's simply providing context that someone armed with a contact weapon can be an imminent deadly force threat, even if they're substantially further than you might expect. Much further than 10 feet, for example. They could be 15 feet away, still be an imminent deadly force threat. It's all a question of how quickly they can close the distance. Well, say you're in that courtroom and you have that prosecutor who paces off 10 feet from the jury box, holds up the knife, asks the jury whether or not he's presenting as a deadly force threat to them. And they think in their heads, well, no, he's too far away. He's reaching out with his arm with the knife and he can't reach them. That's a dangerous jury for you if you defended yourself with the knowledge of the Tueller drill in your mind. You've taken a defensive training class. They taught you the Tueller drill. You're faced in the real world suddenly with an aggressor with a knife. He's 10 feet away. That's well within the Tueller distance of 21 feet. You use deadly defensive force to defend yourself. And now the prosecutor is suggesting to the jury that your use of deadly defensive force was obviously unlawful because the aggressor with the knife was a whole 10 feet away. You know that's not the relevant tactical or legal question. And you'd like the jury to be informed about that as well. So you'd like to be able to explain to the jury, either in your own testimony or more likely in the form of a use of force expert witness hired by your defense. You'd like to have explained to the jury this whole concept of the Tueller drill, and that 10 feet is not too far away. 10 feet, in fact, is well within the Tueller distance. But this knowledge of the Tueller drill is specialized knowledge. It's not something the jury would know by default. It's not common knowledge. It's specialized knowledge. So because the jury won't know it when they're chosen for jury duty, you need to educate them on this specialized knowledge. And you are allowed to educate the jury on specialized knowledge. If you can document to the court that you possessed that specialized knowledge at the moment you acted in self-defense. Because if you did possess that knowledge, then arguably it informed your decision-making in self-defense. Reasonable enough. But what if you only learned about the Tueller drill afterwards? You defend yourself against this guy with the knife, knowing nothing about the Tueller drill, never heard of it. You just shot him because it seemed like the right thing to do. Not because it was informed about any knowledge of the Tueller drill, because you didn't have any knowledge of the Tueller drill. And then after the act of self-defense, while you're waiting this pending trial, you're reading through some self-defense books or something, and oh wow, you learn about the Tueller drill then, and you're like, yeah, see, I did make the right decision. I'm now that I've learned about the Tueller drill. Here's the problem: learning about the Tueller drill after the fact could not have informed your decision making in the moment. And if it couldn't have informed your decision making in the moment, it was not part of your subjective state of mind, and therefore it's not admissible as evidence. Now, you might ask your attorney to argue to the court, well, Your Honor, he did know this at the time, and therefore it should be admissible. It did inform his decision-making. The jury should therefore learn about this. And the prosecution is going to say, well, where's the evidence that he knew it at the time? That he didn't just learn of it afterwards? Because in the absence of evidence that you knew it at the time, well, then, for all we know, you're just making it up. There needs to be something, more than zero, not a lot, but more than zero evidence that you possess knowledge of this Tueller drill at the time you acted in self-defense. And how might you do that? Well, you might have taken a defensive class. You might have read a book. You might have watched this show, this Law of Self-Defense show. And maybe any of those ways you might have acquired knowledge of the Tueller drill before the moment you had to defend yourself against a criminal predator. But how do you document that? Well, we talk about the Tueller drill in our stuff, our books, and I always encourage people, read our book like it was a textbook. It doesn't read like a textbook. It's all written in plain English. But make notes, highlight things, underline things, make notes in the margins, put dates in the margins when you read interesting things that you think, you may use this information to inform your decision-making in self-defense. And then your lawyer could bring this book in. your book, your annotated book, your hand annotated book, as evidence of you having acquired this knowledge before the moment you had to act in self-defense. You may have taken a course, and the course came with a syllabus and a certificate with a date on it. We provide certificates with dates for all our courses. That's documenting that you possess whatever knowledge was in that course. Or if you're a law self-defense member, one of the things we do for our members is we provide documentation of every show we do.